I leave it to him.
Thank you so much, Sam. Okay. So philosophical discussions of the law of armed conflict tend to focus on two legal norms. The first norm prohibits taking civilians as the object of attack, intentionally harming or killing them. The second legal norm prohibits causing excessive incidental harm to civilians, harming them unintentionally but unnecessarily or disproportionately. Now, almost all philosophers writing on the ethics of armed conflict believe that these legal norms are morally justified. Most believe it is morally wrong to inflict intentional, unnecessary, or disproportionate harm on civilians, but even those who believe that some civilians are morally liable to be killed or harmed generally believe that all civilians should remain legally immune from being killed or harmed, lest combatants mistakenly kill or harm the morally liable and the morally immune alike. Since I'm a member of the former group, I will speak as though almost all civilians are morally immune from being killed, but for those of you who take an alternative view, you can modify my claims relatively easily, and they'll still be quite significant. You can basically substitute or insert a non-liable in front of civilian whenever I mention that. So this paper examines the moral justification of a different legal norm, one that has received little attention from philosophers. The law of armed conflict prohibits indiscriminate attacks, including the use of highly imprecise weapons. The V-1 and V-2 rockets employed by German forces toward the end of World War II are often cited as the paradigm case of unlawfully indiscriminate weapons. In recent years, international lawyers have argued that anti-personnel landmines, Scud missiles, cluster munitions, white phosphorus, and Katyusha rockets are also unlawfully indiscriminate. Unfortunately, without a general account of what makes an imprecise weapon unlawfully indiscriminate, such weapon-specific arguments will remain inconclusive. Now, we might imagine that there are two questions here. First, how imprecise must a weapon be before it should be considered unlawfully indiscriminate? And second, what is the moral justification of the legal prohibition of indiscriminate weapons? In fact, I believe the first question cannot be answered independently of the second. And without taking a long detour into some jurisprudential controversies, I'll just assert that when the content of a legal norm cannot be fixed solely by reference to positive legal materials, it's appropriate to resolve any residual legal indeterminacy through moral reasoning in light of the moral aims of that legal norm. Since positive legal materials do not identify a required level of accuracy or precision that a weapon must possess, it is appropriate to conclude that a weapon should be considered unlawfully indiscriminate if its imprecision renders its use morally impermissible. In this paper, I will explore two possible justifications for the legal prohibition on indiscriminate weapons. The prohibition may be justified instrumentally as an indirect strategy of implementing more fundamental moral prohibitions on inflicting intentional, unnecessary, or disproportionate harm on civilians. However, I will argue that it is intrinsically morally wrong to use weapons that, either by their nature or by their use, are more likely to strike civilians or civilian objects than to strike combatants or military objectives, and I conclude that the use of such weapons should be considered unlawfully indiscriminate. So before examining the moral basis of this legal norm, I'm just going to talk very briefly about the legal norm itself. It derives from Article 51.4 of Additional Protocol 1 to the 1949 Geneva Conventions, which prohibit indiscriminate attacks, which it defines as first, or A, those which are not directed at a specific military objective, B, those which employ a method or means of combat, basically a tactic or weapon, which cannot be directed at a specific military objective, or C, those which employ a method or means of combat, the effects of which cannot be limited as required by this protocol, and consequently, in each such case, are of a nature to strike military objectives and civilians or civilian objects without distinction. So, firing blindly into enemy territory or randomly dropping bombs over enemy territory after hitting or missing the original target violates the prohibition of attacks which are not directed at a specific military objective. As for the prohibition of using means or methods which cannot be directed at a specific military objective, this is the one that I will be discussing today. The Red Cross explains that the prohibition applied to long-range missiles which cannot be aimed exactly at the objective. And finally, biological weapons provide the clearest example of weapons, the effects of which cannot be limited to legitimate military targets. So the last thing I'll say about the law is just that 51.4b should not and has not been read literally. Strictly speaking, a weapon, quote, cannot be directed at a specific military objective, only if it strikes completely randomly, right? If there's nothing you can do to increase the likelihood that it will strike your intended target. If aiming the weapon makes it more likely that it will strike its intended target, then in a limited sense it can be directed at that target. Obviously, if that was all the prohibition covered, it would be pretty useless and certainly not fulfill the intentions of the parties. So it's been understood more broadly to prohibit the use of weapons that cannot be accurately or reliably directed at a specific military objective. And this raises the question with which we began: how inaccurate does a weapon have to be before it becomes unlawfully indiscriminate? And positive legal sources do not answer that question. So the use of imprecise weapons might be morally impermissible for at least three reasons. First, the attacking force may in fact intend to kill, harm, or terrorize civilians through the use of imprecise weapons. Second, the use of such weapons may be unnecessary if the party using the weapon could have used different, more accurate weapons instead. And finally, the use of such weapons may be disproportionate in a morally important sense if the military advantage of striking the military target, discounted by the probability of striking that target, is outweighed by the harm of striking civilians, discounted by the probability of striking civilians. And I'm going to call that expectable proportionality or E-proportionality for now. Indeed, most actual uses of imprecise weapons inflict or risk inflicting intentional, unnecessary, or disproportionate harm on civilians and would be morally impermissible on those grounds alone. It's worth noting, however, that each concept, intent, necessity, and proportionality, contains certain ambiguities that would need to be resolved before they can be confidently applied in many cases. For example, attacking forces clearly intend to harm civilians when they use imprecise weapons in order to harm civilians, particularly when their primary purpose is to spread terror. However, attacking forces might also have a disjunctive intention to strike either military targets or nearby civilians and use imprecise weapons because they are relatively indifferent between the two outcomes. And finally, attacking forces may use imprecise weapons in order to strike military targets, but only because or on the condition that even if their weapons miss, they will harm and terrorize civilians, and this will offset the military cost of launching the attack. In the latter case, the attacking force does not consider the possibility of harming civilians as an affirmative reason to launch the attack, but rather as a defeater of a defeater, which offsets the reasons against launching the attack. Now, it's not clear whether the moral and legal prohibition of intentionally attacking civilians applies to these latter cases. I suspect they do apply, but I won't say more about that here. Now, it seems clearly true that, other things equal, it is morally impermissible to use a less precise weapon rather than a more precise weapon when the former will place civilians at greater risk than the latter. Of course, other things are not always equal. For one thing, the use of more precise weapons may place attacking forces at greater risk. For example, the alternative to using cluster munitions to render an area inaccessible to opposing forces may be to clear and hold that area with one's own ground forces. Yet the use of less precise weapons cannot always be justified by reference to the risks to one's own forces of using more precise weapons. As David Luban and I have argued separately, elsewhere, and on somewhat different grounds, combatants ought to use more discriminating means and methods of combat, unless doing so will increase the marginal risk to those combatants to a substantially greater degree than using less discriminating means or methods would increase the marginal risk to civilians. Since I've addressed those issues at length elsewhere, I won't do so here, although I'm happy to talk about it. Finally, some attacking forces may not have more precise weapons that can achieve the desired effect. For example, non-state armed groups that use primitive rockets against advanced militaries often do not have more precise weapons that deliver comparable explosive payloads. Yet the absence of precise weapons does not necessarily render permissible the use of imprecise weapons. Among other things, the use of imprecise weapons may be disproportionate in the sense defined above. The military advantage of striking the target, discounted by the probability of striking it, may be outweighed by the harm of striking civilians, discounted by the probability of striking those civilians. As I will discuss at length below, the use of an imprecise weapon is impermissible if it is disproportionate in this sense, but even an attack that is proportionate in this sense may be impermissible if it is sufficiently imprecise. So first I'm going to talk about the instrumentalist justification for the prohibition on imprecise weapons. So if the use of imprecise weapons is morally wrong only if it inflicts intentional, unnecessary, or disproportionate harm on civilians, then why have an independent legal prohibition on the use of imprecise weapons? Why not rely on the distinct legal prohibitions on inflicting intentional, unnecessary, or disproportionate harm on civilians? For one thing, combatants may better conform to those distinct prohibitions indirectly by directly following the prohibition on using imprecise weapons. While combatants necessarily know if they are inflicting intentional harm on civilians, and generally know if they are inflicting unnecessary harm on civilians, they do not always know if they are inflicting disproportionate harm on civilians, since this requires probabilistic reasoning and predictive uncertainty. Combatants might better avoid inflicting disproportionate harm on civilians by never using imprecise weapons than by trying to evaluate the proportionality of using imprecise weapons on a case-by-case basis. If so, then the legal prohibition of using imprecise weapons would be instrumentally morally justified. Now, of course, such a rationale for the legal prohibition of imprecise weapons could succeed only if the content of the prohibition could be identified independently of its underlying rationale. If combatants have to determine whether the use of a weapon would be disproportionate in order to determine whether it is unlawfully imprecise, then they would be no better off following the prohibition on imprecise weapons than following the direct prohibition on disproportionate attacks. Now, how might we identify the content of the prohibition without simply applying the prohibition of disproportionate attacks? Now, one approach would be to look to legal conventions, positive legal norms that specifically prohibit certain weapons, such as biological weapons, on the grounds of their imprecision. These legal norms could be followed directly without reference to their underlying rationale. We would, of course, want to know what leads states to recognize a weapon as unlawfully imprecise. Presumably, states will reject a particular weapon only if the use of that weapon is very rarely proportionate, and the proportionate uses of that weapon are very rarely necessary to victory. When these conditions are satisfied, states will have much to gain and little to lose from agreeing with other states to abstain from using the weapon in future conflicts. Moreover, since states will accept or reject a ban on a particular weapon based on its military utility and its impact on civilians, such bans cannot be entirely dismissed as merely conventional or morally arbitrary. Now, one potential problem with relying on weapon-specific categorical prohibitions is that such an approach prohibits only weapons that are, in legal terms, indiscriminate by their nature, but not weapons that are indiscriminate by their use. The approach might not allow us to say, for example, that it is unlawful to use cluster munitions against infantry units traveling through cities and towns, but lawful to use cluster munitions against tank formations far from civilian areas. Some states might resist a categorical ban on cluster munitions while admitting that international law should regulate their use. But perhaps even categorical prohibitions of specific weapons could be limited to their use in or near civilian areas. So perhaps this objection could be overcome. There's another problem with the categorical approach, namely that it seems to justify specific prohibitions of particular imprecise weapons rather than the general prohibition of all imprecise weapons. So even if states do not ban a specific weapon by treaty, an international consensus that a weapon is unlawful due to its inaccuracy generates a norm of customary international law prohibiting the use of that weapon. Rather than providing the content of the general legal prohibition, state consensus on specific weapons simply generates specific legal prohibitions. There's a danger that on the view we are exploring, the general prohibition on indiscriminate weapons will serve only as a preamble to the specific prohibitions that actually guide the conduct of combatants. But perhaps this objection could also be overcome, for example, through the use of analogical reasoning. For example, we might argue that any weapon violates the general prohibition if it is as or more imprecise than those weapons that violate a specific prohibition. This would leave the general prohibition with some independent content. So it is possible that a meaningful legal prohibition on imprecise weapons can be morally justified on instrumentalist grounds. Nevertheless, I will argue that this legal prohibition rests on an independent, non-instrumental moral foundation. I will argue that it is inherently morally impermissible for combatants to use weapons that are more likely to strike civilians or civilian objects than opposing combatants or military objectives. The use of such weapons is morally impermissible even if the attacking force does not intend to harm civilians, does not possess more precise weapons, and even if the expected military advantage substantially outweighs the expected harm to civilians and is therefore proportionate. The legal prohibition of indiscriminate attacks may therefore rest on the inherent moral wrongfulness of the legally prohibited conduct rather than the instrumental value of the legal prohibition itself. So we've already seen that the use of an imprecise weapon is morally impermissible, even if it is not intended to harm civilians and even if it is not the most precise weapon available, if it is disproportionate. Again, if the expected military advantage, if the intended military advantage discounted by the probability of achieving it does not outweigh the harm to civilians discounted by the probability that civilians will be harmed. To see that even an proportionate use of an imprecise weapon can be morally impermissible, consider the following skeletal scenarios. Now, it's important, and this is where the handout comes in. Now, what's important about these scenarios is that the civilians involved are members of the same political community, so we don't have stronger associative duties to any particular group of them. And second, that the only military advantage relevant is preserving civilian life from immoral and illegal attacks. And you can imagine this either in the context of a humanitarian intervention or in the context of a non-international armed conflict between a state and an organized armed group. So, and by describing military advantage solely in terms of human lives, we're better able to recognize the effect of other moral considerations on our intuitive moral judgments. So here's the first case, and this is 3071. If you strike the target, you will save 100 civilians from being killed. However, there's only a 30% chance of hitting your target and a 70% chance of missing your target and killing 40 other civilians. Now, launching the attack would maximize expected value. In this case, the number of survivors discounted by the probability of their survival. Sorry? 140. So you would kill 40 and fail to save the 100. So the expected number of deaths if you do not attack is 100. The expected number of deaths if you attack is 98, which is 70% of 140. Therefore, the expected value of the attack is 2 saved lives. Yet, launching these strikes seems intuitively impermissible. So why? Now, one reason might be that we are not merely comparing possible outcomes, but possible actions. And the permissibility of an action is affected by its causal structure as well as by its causal consequences. So if killing is even slightly worse than letting die, then the expected value of 2 saved lives may not be enough to justify taking the risk of killing 40 civilians. We could say that the expected moral value of launching the attack would then be negative, not positive. So the expected consequential value would be swamped by the expected moral value, outweighed by it. So maybe the asymmetry between killing and letting die is doing most of the work here, but I don't think it's doing all of the work here. And before continuing, I won't make a ton of use of this term, but I'm going to call an attack that is proportionate even when the deontic features of the action are taken into account. I'm going to call that a DE proportionate or DE disproportionate attack, so its deontic features are taken into account. Since we don't know precisely how much worse it is to kill than to let die, it's difficult to construct a scenario in which an attack is demonstrably DE proportionate, but still intuitively impermissible. Nevertheless, we know that as expected value increases, DE disproportionality at least decreases. In other words, if DE proportionality determines permissibility, other things equal, then an attack that is less DE disproportionate will be proportionately less wrongful and easier to defend. So with this in mind, consider the following case, 3072. If you strike the target, you will save 100 civilians from being killed. However, there is only a 30% chance of hitting your target and a 70% chance of missing your target and killing 10 other civilians. Now, the expected number of deaths if you do not attack is once again 100. The expected number of deaths if you attack is 77, 70% of 110. Therefore, the expected value of the attack is 23 saved lives. Now, if we think that the attack in 3072 is intuitively impermissible, and I think that it is, then it seems like the asymmetry between killing and letting die probably can't explain that impermissibility, because in order to do so, killing would have to be many times worse than letting die, and that would probably not be plausible. But even if it is, right, even if the asymmetry between killing and letting die is quite significant, 3072, the attack in 3072 does not seem much less bad or much easier to justify than 3071, which is what we would expect. We would expect a dramatic increase in our willingness to contemplate 3072 over 3071, and I don't intuitively feel that way. I feel like these two cases are morally more or less on a par. So this suggests that the probabilities themselves carry intrinsic moral significance. So we vary the probabilities. So the final example varies the probabilities, but leaves the expected value roughly the same as in 3072. So this is the case called 7030. If you strike the target, you will save 50 civilians from being killed. However, there's a 70% chance of hitting your target and a 30% chance of missing your target and killing 50 other civilians. So the expected number of deaths if you do not attack is 50. The expected number of deaths if you do attack is 30% of 100. Therefore, the expected value of launching the attack is 20 saved lives, which is about the same as in 3072. And yet the attack in 7030 seems much easier to defend, dramatically so. And this suggests that the probabilities themselves carry intrinsic moral weight. So why might that be? Or what could account for those intuitions, or what could substitute for those intuitions if those cases don't seem compelling to you? So to understand when it is wrong to use imprecise weapons, we should try to imagine defending the killing or harming of civilians as a result of using such weapons. So first imagine that you're a pilot. You fire a highly accurate missile at a legitimate military target located in a civilian area. In midair, the missile's guidance system malfunctions. The missile veers off course and strikes a group of civilians. You've killed these civilians, infringed their right to life, albeit unintentionally, and you must now explain why their deaths are not your fault. You cannot justify killing them, since they are not morally liable to be killed, and their deaths did not prevent far greater harm to others. But you might offer the following excuse. Not only did you not intend to kill any civilians, you reasonably believed that you would not kill any civilians, since the probability that you would kill civilians was less than the probability that you would strike your target and kill no civilians. Of course, this is not a complete excuse. In addition, you might also have to show that the probability of killing civilians was so low and the military advantage of your intended target so great that the expected value of your launching the missile was not only positive, but quite substantial. So it was DE proportionate as well. Now imagine that instead you're a member of a non-state armed group. You fire a very inaccurate missile at a legitimate military target located in a civilian area. The missile misses its target and strikes a group of civilians. Now, as before, you cannot justify the killing of the civilians. Moreover, you cannot offer the same excuse as before. You cannot say that you reasonably believed you would kill no civilians, because the probability of killing civilians was greater than the probability of striking your target and killing no civilians. Now, you may be able to say that the military value of your intended target was quite high, and the expected value of launching your missile was substantial. But as I will argue below, this is not enough to excuse your actions. So in general, an action is justified only if it is supported by an undefeated reason, and excused if it is supported by an undefeated reason to believe that it is justified. Indeed, the paradigm excuse is justified belief in justification. Conversely, an action cannot be excused if it is based on defeated reasons to believe that it is justified. Since the use of an imprecise weapon will prove justified only if it strikes a legitimate target, the use of such a weapon is excusable only if the attacker has undefeated reasons to believe that the weapon will strike a legitimate target. It follows that one cannot justify or excuse the use of an imprecise weapon if one's reasons to believe that weapon will strike civilians are stronger than, and thereby defeat, one's reasons to believe that the weapon will strike a legitimate military target. Put another way, it is morally unjustifiable and inexcusable to use a weapon that will probably, or more likely than not, strike civilians. Now, the moral requirement of justified belief in justification explains the permissibility of the first attack and the impermissibility of the second attack. More broadly, this moral requirement sets a minimum level of accuracy that every weapon must satisfy. Weapons that one cannot reasonably believe will strike a legitimate target should be considered unlawfully indiscriminate. Now, I've thus far described my position in terms of justification and excuse, concepts more familiar within criminal law theory than mainstream moral philosophy. My position could just as easily be expressed in a different idiom. So following Jeff, we might say that the killing of a civilian with an imprecise weapon is objectively impermissible, and that the use of such a weapon is subjectively impermissible when it is unreasonable to believe that the weapon will strike a legitimate target. Alternatively, following Derek Parfit, we might say that the killing of civilians with imprecise weapons is wrong in the fact-relative sense, and that the use of imprecise weapons is wrong in the evidence-relative sense when one has most or decisive reason to believe that they will strike civilians or civilian objects. Importantly, the reasonable belief requirement I am proposing may not be absolute. For example, the use of an imprecise weapon might be permissible if it would expectably save, if it would expectably save 100 times as many civilians as it could possibly kill. That is, if the number of civilians it might save, discounted by the probability that it would save them, is 100 times greater than the number of civilians it could possibly kill. And that would be true even if it would probably kill, or most likely kill, some civilians and save none. Indeed, assuming the use of the weapons is not intended to harm civilians, the deontological threshold for the permissible use of such a weapon will be lower than the deontological threshold for permissibly attacking civilians intentionally, if such a thing is permissible. For example, if it is permissible to intentionally harm N civilians to prevent comparable harm to N times X civilians, then it should be permissible to use an imprecise weapon that could harm as many as N civilians, if doing so will expectably save N times X minus Y civilians. Now, how much lower the threshold should be, the value of Y relative to X, is a question that I do not know how to resolve. But I don't have to resolve that now. I can leave that open. So finally, I want to return to the alternative thought that E proportionality or DE proportionality is sufficient to justify the use of an imprecise weapon, and I'm going to discuss that in the context of Derek Parfit's discussion of expectabilism. So Parfit defines expectabilism as the view that, quote, when the rightness of some act depends on the goodness of the act's effects or possible effects, we ought to act or try to act in the way whose outcome would be expectably best, where the expectably best outcome is the outcome with the highest expected value. Of course, I've argued that the use of imprecise weapons can be morally impermissible, even if such use would be expectably best. So, is expectabilism false? How could it be morally impermissible to do what is expectably best? So let me start by flipping the question around. Why ever seek the expectably best outcome rather than the probably best outcome? Why ever do what will maximize expected value rather than what will probably maximize actual value? So for example, imagine you were offered a bet with a 30% chance of winning $100 and a 70% chance of losing $10. Why take such a bet when the likely outcome is that you will lose $10 and gain nothing? So first, if you take the same bet a sufficiently large number of times, then over time, your winnings will exceed your losses. Second, if you always take bets with positive expected value, then over time, your winnings will once again exceed your losses. Most generally, if you always do what maximizes expected value, then over time, you will maximize actual value. In other words, by always doing what is expectably best, you will perform a series of actions with greater actual value than the series of actions you would perform by always doing what is probably best. So, although Parfit presents expectabilism as an aspect of act consequentialism, it is better understood as an aspect of rule consequentialism. Paraphrasing Parfit, everyone ought to follow expectabilism because the universal acceptance of expectabilism would make things go best from an impartial point of view. Now, it would seem that, according to expectabilism, the e-proportionate use of imprecise weapons is permissible, even when the weapons would probably strike civilians, because the universal acceptance of a rule permitting the e-proportionate use of imprecise weapons will make things go best, that is, result in substantially greater military advantage than civilian harm. Now, Parfit defines expectabilism, actually, I'm going to skip that part. Indeed, we have already seen that the permissibility of using imprecise weapons depends not only on their effects, but also on how those effects are brought about. In particular, the most important bad effects of using imprecise weapons involve doings, notably killings, while the most important bad effects of not using imprecise weapons involve allowings, notably lettings die. These deontic features of using imprecise weapons give us additional deontic reasons not to use such weapons, over and above any non-deontic impartial reasons we might have to use or not use such weapons. It was for this reason that we introduced the concept of DE proportionality to describe an attack in which the expected military advantage outweighs the expected harm to civilians by sufficient proportion to override the moral asymmetry between killing and letting die. But of course, we're now exploring a stronger position. Now, it's generally accepted that an action that intentionally wrongs another person, that intentionally infringes her rights or breaches a duty owed to her, cannot be defended on rule consequentialist grounds alone. For example, it would be morally impermissible to punish all crimes disproportionately, excessively, for the sake of general deterrence, even if this would reduce both the aggregate harm caused by crime and the aggregate harm inflicted through punishment. In general, we cannot justify or excuse wrongs committed against one person solely in terms of the aggregate consequences of acting similarly in similar situations. We have to be able to defend our treatment of her, to her, based on our reasonable beliefs about the impact of our action on her rights and welfare and on the rights and welfare of others. For similar reasons, an action that one has most or decisive reason to believe will wrong another person also cannot be defended on rule consequentialist grounds alone. Return to the two cases discussed in the previous section. The pilot can defend her attack by saying to any civilians killed, "I reasonably believed that I would strike my intended legitimate target and thereby prevent substantially greater harm to others." In contrast, the armed group member cannot defend her actions by saying, "I reasonably believed that I would miss my intended target, harm civilians, and prevent no harm to others. However, I also reasonably believed that if I and others like me launch similar attacks in similar situations, then over the long run, we will prevent substantially greater more harm than we inflict." So why precisely does the latter defense fail? Is it because the defense ignores the separateness of persons, their dignity, or their inviolability? Or is it because the defense rests on a principle that those affected by its application could reasonably reject? Does the defense fail for some combination of these reasons, or for reasons that are not yet well understood? I'm not yet in a position to say. Fortunately, we need not converge on a true theory of normative ethics in order to recognize a false theory of normative ethics. Expectabilism is plausible when only the welfare of others is at stake, but not when the rights of others are at risk. So, to conclude, I've argued that it is almost always morally impermissible to use weapons that are more likely to strike civilians and civilian objects than to strike combatants and military objectives. Such weapons should be considered unlawfully indiscriminate. In addition, the legal prohibition of such weapons may justifiably remain absolute, since the use of such weapons will hardly ever be morally permissible, and even a narrow legal permission to use such weapons may be abused far more than it is properly used. And finally, the use of weapons that are not unlawfully indiscriminate in this sense are still unlawful if the weapons are used with the intent to harm civilians, or if they place civilians at unnecessary E disproportionate or DE disproportionate risk. It is almost certainly the case that no war has ever been fought in full compliance with the law of armed conflict. It is also probably the case that even a war fought in full compliance with the law would not be fully just. But by properly understanding the law's moral foundations, we can better understand what makes wars fought in violation of the law particularly unjust. Moreover, by clarifying what the law permits and forbids, we may help make war less unjust than it would be otherwise. Given the stakes, this seems to me a worthwhile aim in which we're, of course, all engaged. Thank you.